So good morning everyone, and thank you for being here on this very wet and windy day. As you said, my name is Kate Laffan and I work in the Psychological Behavioural Science Department, largely on the role of the individual in addressing the climate crisis. But today I'm going to talk to you about what gets in the way of our green intentions and looking at meat as a case study. So I'd like to start with a question. For everyone in the room, hands up if you've ever formulated intentions to reduce your meat consumption. I was expecting that because it's a bit of a selection effect who shows up for this talk. Keep your hands up, keep your hands up. And then keep your hands up if you've always perfectly followed through on those intentions. Not a single one. So nobody in this room is perfect, myself included. And that's true of many domains of life. So we call these intention behavior gaps. Intentions are these self-instructions to perform behaviors or certain actions. And intention behavior gaps are when we don't actually manage to follow through on that self-instruction. So they occur everywhere in life. It's one of the most robust findings in social psychology is that we don't always act as we intend. It happens in exercise, it happens in food, in terms of the food that we eat, the food that we don't eat, how we travel. It happens in medication adherence, condom use. There's lots of areas of life where we intend to act in certain ways, and when we fail to follow through, we're not acting as we intended, but it also can have serious consequences for ourselves, and in the cases that I'm interested in, also for the planet. So in my research, I'm really interested in those areas of consumption where increasingly lots of people are intending to act in certain ways that would be beneficial for the planet, but are often getting into trouble in actually converting those intentions into action. So you can think of lots of different things in terms of the energy that you use, how you travel, the clothes that you wear, your ethical consumption around all sorts of things. But particularly today, we're going to talk about meat consumption as being one of those headline areas of consumption that people increasingly have intentions around and have major environmental impacts when they don't follow through on those intentions. So in order for there to be intention behavior gaps, there have to be intentions in the first place. And so should we expect that, or are there data to suggest that people are formulating these intentions? Well, across 10 different European countries, when they were asked in 2020, Austria, Denmark, France, Germany, Italy, Netherlands, Poland, Romania, Spain, UK, across all of these countries, over 30% of the population in representative samples were saying that they would expect or intend to eat less meat in the next 6 months. Some were saying a little less, in fact most of them were saying a little less, but others were saying less. So there is increasingly a non-insignificant amount of the population in these countries that's saying, yes, I actually do intend to consume less red meat, or less meat in this case, but increasingly less red meat as well. And so the question is, should we try to encourage them to follow through? And why might we want to encourage them to follow through? Probably given the hands up at the beginning of this talk, the reasons why you might want to eat less meat might not be lost on this group. But just briefly to say, across health, environment, animal welfare, there are lots of good reasons why you'd want to reduce your consumption of meat, and red meat in particular. Meat consumption is associated with cardiovascular disease. Overconsumption of meat is associated with cardiovascular disease, some types of cancer. Meat is also one of the most resource-intensive types of protein that we can eat as humans in terms of land use, in terms of water. It's also the type of diet, heavy consumption of meat is also associated with high carbon emissions relative to plant-based proteins. So good reasons for health, good reasons for environment. And you only need to look at the factory farms around the world or the intensive farming practices around the world related to animal-based proteins to seriously query the animal welfare consequences of overconsumption of meat as well. So for all those good reasons, and these are the kinds of reasons that people are citing when they suggest they have intentions to reduce their consumption, we might want to think about how we can actually help them to follow through. From a behavioural welfare perspective, there's also something interesting about if people are stating that they have these preferences and then they're failing to follow through on those preferences, it could be that by helping them to do so, we not only yield all of these benefits, but we also help them to live the kinds of lives that they are aspiring to live, that they intend to live, and in doing so, contribute to their well-being as well. So lots of good reasons, that's the plug for why. Should we expect that intention behavior gaps emerge in diet? So I've already told you that it emerges almost everywhere you look for it, but we do have evidence that people do fail to convert their intentions into action in and around meat consumption. So in one study that was a control and treatment group, the control group that stated they had intentions to reduce their meat consumption were no more likely 4 weeks later to have done so than people who didn't hold those intentions. So that's suggesting that there's actually no link between intention behavior. A little bit pessimistic. In fact, when we look at sort of meta-analyses, it's about 27% of the variance in behavior at one point in time can be explained by intentions previously. So there is a link between intentions and behavior, but it's certainly not a perfect one. And there's many, many reasons why we might expect people to run into trouble. when we look at the social psychology literature, what do we actually know about who falls into trouble? So we know a fair bit about individual differences. So that's to say, what is it about John that means that he fails to follow through, whereas Anne has a better time of it, where she manages more often than not. There's things like her level of conscientiousness. So if she's a more conscientious person than John, she's more likely to follow through. Her level of mindfulness. If she's more of the kind of person that spends time noticing her actions and present in the moment, she's also more likely to follow through. And if she's more future oriented. So she's the kind of person that is less waiting of the present moment, less sort of falls prey less to her desires in the moment, then she's also less likely to fail with her intentions. But that's just looking across individuals. There's also the question of what do we know about the kinds of intentions that people, because you can formulate all sorts of kinds of intentions. Which are the kinds of intentions that are better off at following through on? So some research suggests promotion intentions. So I will do something, you're more likely to follow through on than prevention ones, I won't. So I will eat vegetarian food has a better shot than I won't eat meat. Other other types of intentions that are sort of related to autonomy, so ones that you formulate yourself. So I've made this decision that I would like to, as opposed to an external force telling you that you should formulate these intentions and then doing so and then seeing how they follow through. So autonomous intentions are also more successful. But what we don't really know much about in the literature is poor John. Within John's life, he goes about his days. On a Monday, he might be quite successful at following through on his intentions. On a Friday, he might get himself into trouble. And the literature has almost nothing to say about how those intertemporal processes unfold, the self-regulation that John goes through to try to make sure that those intentions are actually enacted. And so that's what I'm really interested in my own research, is trying to understand what are the situations that get John into trouble? Where does he manage and where doesn't he manage to follow through on his intentions? And so we're looking at that in a study with Professor Liam Delaney, who's the head of department in psychological behavioural science, but also with Leonard Lades, who's at University College Dublin. We're interested in looking at that situational unfolding of John's life as he's trying to reduce his meat consumption in a big representative study in the UK. So the study has a really mad design. It took a long time to get it right, but essentially it's broken down into different surveys with the same population over time. So we started out with a representative sample of the UK population, and we wanted to just ask the question, how prevalent are these intentions? So for all the people that we have, how many of them are really thinking about reducing both meat and dairy in this study? And once we'd identified that population, we also had a booster sample of 3,000 people in order to identify enough people to follow through with over time to try to understand how their intentions unfold. We then, once we'd had our reducer sample, that's what we're calling them, we did a baseline survey where we asked them a load of individual differences, characteristics, so time preferences, risk preferences, social preferences, lots of questions around their intentions, but also the reasons behind their intentions, as well as their past consumption, their past failures, that kind of information. And then we followed up with them longitudinally with event reconstruction exercises. So has anyone ever heard of the day reconstruction studies? Day reconstruction studies have come out of well-being research. The idea is really that you revive people's memories about the day yesterday. So I'll ask you, okay, think through your day yesterday. And you'll tell me you'll write down little notes about the different things that went on during your day yesterday, where you were, who you were with. And then I'll hone in on specific episodes yesterday and ask you very, very specific questions, having done that revivification episode. So what we do is we don't look at the whole day yesterday, but we look at your main meals yesterday, your breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So just 2 seconds now, I'd like you to think, okay, just like for your breakfast, where were you yesterday? Can you think? Has anybody got no memory of it? Okay, and now I'm going to ask you, having had that little moment to think about it, and in the context of this study, it would have been more specific. It would have been diary-based, so you'd have to write a bit more about it. Do you remember what you had for breakfast yesterday? Is anyone brave enough to tell me whether they had meat yesterday? For breakfast? No big English breakfast yesterday morning? Okay, but at least you have a sense of what you had, right? There is a memory in your mind as to what you had, and if I asked you where that meal was, could you tell me? And if I asked you who you were with, could you tell me? So this whole idea of day reconstruction, event reconstruction, is really to jog your memory so that we can get better at those situational variables to try to understand what are the predictors in terms of situations that mean it's more or less likely that you ate meat at your breakfast yesterday, lunch yesterday, dinner yesterday. So we do that twice over the course of the study. The study went on for 4 weeks. And then at the very end, of course, we ask you questions about your consumption to see whether you were successful or not overall in reducing your meat consumption over those 4 weeks. In terms of outcomes that we're interested in, well, it turns out it's actually quite hard to get at intention behavior gaps when somebody intends to reduce their consumption. So one of the reasons for that is that if I ask you, do you intend to reduce your consumption overall? You say yes to me, or over the next 4 weeks, you can say yes to me. But that doesn't mean on any given consumption occasion that you necessarily plan to not have it. So I could say, yes, absolutely, I plan to reduce, but when I'm over at my mum's on Sunday, I'm going to have the roast. So trying to link situations to intention behavior gaps is actually kind of a complicated exercise. So what we did was we had 3 outcomes that we were interested in. The first is whether somebody desired meat. This is my representation of whether someone desired meat. Whether in the moment you desired meat, irrespective of whether you ate it. And that's linking some work that talks about how situations can cue desires in people, that's something that temptations are presented by situations, and that's one thing that we might be interested in. The second is, of course, because of all of those outcomes that we're interested in, whether you actually ate the meat. That's of primary importance, right? And then lastly, this is my representation of regret. It's whether you ate the meat and regretted the meat. And so across all of these outcomes, we're trying to map the process of intention behavior gaps, how they emerge. Sometimes you'll desire but manage to resist desire in a self-controllable attempt. Sometimes you'll eat it, but maybe it's not one of those occasions where you even intended not to. And then eventually we'll have this idea of, okay, you ate it and regretted it. Trying to hone in on really those occasions. Regret is one way you could think about how intention behavior gaps emerge as those consumption episodes that on reflection you're like, I wish I'd acted in a different way. So those are our outcomes. In terms of what we look at for predictors, again, a whole bunch of stuff. So I should say this was all pre-registered, but it's a very exploratory exercise. So we're not going in there looking for one specific situational variable as it links to a specific outcome. We're trying to map, if you will, behaviorally map all of the ways that intention behavior gaps might be influenced by situations. So we've got things like the day of the week, the time of day, the meal type. We've got where you were, so whether it's eating outside of the home, at home, so on and so forth. Social indicators, who you were with, whether the people you were with were eating meat, whether they had some sort of influence over what you ate. And then self-reported decision factors. So if you think back to that thing where I was asking you to think about your breakfast yesterday and whether or not you ate meat. So putting the meat question to one side, there's also a question of what was important to you yesterday morning? Was it that you were running out the door and it was actually just a convenient meal and you just needed to eat something so that you managed to get through to lunch? Or was it a breakfast that you were having with family and friends where it was really about enjoying the moment and it was about taste and it was about company? You'll all have a different picture of your breakfast this morning. I imagine most people were convenience given that it was a Tuesday morning. But we do ask these questions. We ask, in the moment, what was important to you? Was it cost? Was it convenience? Was the environmental impacts of your food front of mind? The nutrition of your food front of mind. And the last thing we do, and I have it here as a picture of a diamond, I'm going to show you this scale later, but the diamond scale is a scale in social psychology that looks to try to characterize situations in terms of their most salient features, whether it was a positive situation, whether it was a romantic situation, whether it was a situation in which work needed to be done that was more sort of instrumental, like let's go, I've got to go, I've had my breakfast and I need to get to work. So I'll show you the scale later, but really this idea was to take all of these different situational factors and map them onto these incidents of breakfast, lunch and dinner yesterday to try to understand when people were successful with their intentions and when they fell down on them. So just in terms of the descriptives of that representative sample that I mentioned before, 1.5% of people reported being vegan, 5.1 vegetarian and 2.8 pescatarian. And so we left these people, that's where we left them. We had some background characteristics, but they weren't of interest for our particular use for our study. And we only proceeded with people who reported that they actually did eat meat. Of the people that were left in the sample who reported eating meat, 21.5% of them reported intentions to consume less meat over the following 4 weeks. Now 21% or 21.5% is less than that 30% that I told you about before. But we were very interested in quite a strict criterion. So we have 4 weeks' time, which is kind of the stricter you make this in stating your intentions, the less likely it is that people are going to say that they do have these intentions. The previous question asked, over the next 6 months. Well, it's kind of easier to say over the next 6 months I intend to reduce my consumption. We wanted to have quite a narrow window so that we could follow up with them, but also that we were identifying those people who were quite serious about their intentions and really had a picture of how that might play out over the next 4 weeks. In terms of descriptives, it was more likely that women reported these intentions than men, but there were no massive age differences. So we're just seeing this pattern, which you do see a lot in terms of meat reduction literature, that women were more likely to hold these intentions than men. And then thinking about the diary entries that we have, so when we follow them up and we ask about the breakfast, lunch and dinner yesterday, we have 3,000 episodes or something like that. 33% of the time, the people were eating meat. Now remember, this is a sample of people who want to reduce their meat. 33% of the times that they were reporting on any meal at all, they reported desiring meat. So whether or not they were eating it, they were very much thinking about it. This was something that was salient to them in their minds when they were eating. Then, looking to eating it, 27% of the time when they were eating at all, they report actually eating a meat. So there isn't a huge amount of evidence for self-control efforts here if 33% of the desire occasions were actually being converted into eating meat. So self-control is part of the picture, but it's certainly not all of it. And then when we look at regret, so that's following through eating the meat and turning around and regretting it, that reduces down to about 13%. So I would argue that one way to think about intention behavior gaps is this 13% of the time. It's not like every single time this meat reducer sample ate meat, they turned around and regretted it. It was just about half of that time where they thought, wish I'd acted in a different way. And so maybe those are the occasions that we should be really focusing in on and thinking, okay, well, how do we help them on those occasions? So then I'm going to bring you through a whole load, like I told you, all the predictors and what goes into those occasions, what makes it more or less likely that they eat meat, want to eat meat, regret meat. So across the days of the week, there isn't a whole pile going on, to be honest. I was expecting more of a pattern, and you do see patterns, typically in social psychology, you do see patterns in different things like time preferences, risk preferences over the course of the week. We don't see much apart from a Sunday effect here. So this is, everything's being compared to Monday, and we see that you're more likely to eat meat, but not eat meat and regret it on a Sunday than you are on a Monday. Nothing else really going on. And so that was kind of a surprising finding in the sense that I thought there'd be more of a weekend effect. There's no evidence, but it's not very strong. Looking then about breakfast, lunch and dinner, this is a UK sample, and so you want to think about what's typical of a UK diet, but we are seeing very strongly that dinner are those occasions when dinner relative to breakfast are those occasions when people want, eat and regret eating meat. So it isn't as much about breakfast, and maybe it's not surprising then that you guys were also not eating meat at breakfast yesterday. It's much less about breakfast than it is about dinner, and to some degree lunch. We also had a measure of whether it was a routine or a special occasion, and so is it that kind of instrumental consumption where you're just kind of eating to get going, or is it something particular about this meal where it's something special like a birthday or a meal out? And it was much more likely that you would fall down on your intentions on those special occasions. So there is something about a treat, and we've done some qualitative work that's followed up on this, that there's something about meat as a treat that seems to really get in the way of people with their intentions. Looking then at physical predictors, so everything here in this graph has been compared to at home. You're much safer at home. You're much safer, your intentions are much safer to the extent that you have them at home. Less so when you're eating out. You both want, ate and regret eating meat out. At a friend's and relative's house, want and eat meat more often than at home. And then the rest of the places that you spend time in, work and school, there's not obvious evidence. So there is something about being in restaurants and cafes, but also over in friends and relatives' houses that makes it much more likely that you follow through. Another finding that I don't know if we have it up there. Yeah, we do. Okay. Is in and around social predictors. So there's a bit of an overlap between where you are and who you're with. But here we're really the strongest, I would say the strongest finding in all of this research is that it's not me, it's you. It's really about eating around other people. So when you're alone, you're much safer in terms of your intentions. They're much more likely to be followed through on. The minute you're around family, friends, or your partner, not children, which I thought was interesting. Children changes in dairy. Actually, children makes it more likely in dairy, but not in meat. But for family, friends, partners, it's all their fault, really. Being around them gets you into trouble. And particularly when we start to control for whether those other people are eating meat, those signs turn negative. So it's not about being around other people while you're consuming food. It's about being around other people that are eating meat around you. And that's something that is interesting that we see it across wanting meat, eating meat, and regretting meat, because it's not just that that's what's available in the environment, it's actually a temptation that they're presenting you with. So these people around you are eating meat, and that means that it's harder for you to kind of get away from that temptation of meat. We also see, and this is quite a nice one, I don't know exactly how to interpret this, but we also see that when others are choosing it for you or have some influence in choosing what you're eating, you're much more likely to fall down on your intentions. And some of that might just be practical, that it's their responsibility, but we also see that for people who have some input and not just entirely making the decision, which suggests that there's almost like a bit of wiggle room that arises. There's moral wiggle room that arises when other people are involved in the decision-making process that maybe isn't so clearly there when you're eating alone. Okay, before I go to the self-reported decision factors, I just want to check, is it all, any questions? Conscious of time, I've just seen. So I'll zip through the self-reported decision factors. Remember I said before, I was asking about what are the things that were important to you in your breakfast yesterday? Was it just about getting out the door and eating something quick, or did you really think about what are the environmental impacts? And here again, there's kind of this message that it's about those tempting options, meat as a treat. When taste, craving, quality are important, we're seeing that people are much more likely to want, eat, and regret eating meat. And there's other, which is maybe perhaps unsurprising when you're thinking about environment, when animal welfare is front of mind, when convenience is front of mind. Those are the times when it's much less likely for you. So it's less about these instrumental consumption as it is about, luxuriating in your breakfast yesterday or your lunch or dinner yesterday. And this is the diamond scale that I mentioned. I just wanted to mention it because I think it's a really cool scale that's not often used and should be much more widely used. This tries to boil down all of situational research into these psychological variables about how we can characterize situations. And the things that it says is things like, did work have to be done? Was deep thinking required? Was someone being threatened or accused, criticized? Was there potential for romance? Was the situation pleasant or less pleasant? Was someone being deceived? Was social interactions possible? And when we look at mapping that diamond scale onto these situations, we see that, again, positivity, sociality, mating, these are all the times when intentions can often go astray in terms of meat. And duty, which is when work had to be done, so again, instrumental type consumption, we're not seeing anything like as much of a problem. So kind of to wrap up the key takeaways that I would take from all of this descriptive analysis, which I completely see there's a lot to take in over a short period of time, is that intention behavior gaps emerge in meat consumption when it's hedonic rather than instrumental type consumption. So by that I mean it's more about a treat than trying to just conveniently get some food. When eating in the presence of others who are eating meat, and when others are responsible for food choices. So that's an awful lot of description. What's the use of all of that description? Well, oftentimes in behavioral science, at least, we jump into designing interventions. We say, okay, well, listen, this is the behavior we want to achieve. We want to help people to eat less meat. Okay, how do we go about doing that? And we come up with some kind of clever trick that plays into their heuristics or their biases that can help them do that. What I think this exercise helps us do is try to understand, well, where do we actually even start in terms of aiming our interventions to help people? And so there's two ways you can think about interventions that could be informed by this research. The first is cueing interventions, so thinking about designing interventions in context. So now we know a lot of trouble happens in restaurants, a lot of trouble happens over in family and friend, those kinds of meals, Sunday dinners. How would we want to think about behavioral interventions, information campaigns that would be targeted at those contexts that really, really matter, according to this research? And the other is around training interventions. So almost by far the best research on how to overcome intention behavior gaps is about planning strategies. So implementation intentions, you make if-then plans. So if I find myself in a situation where there's no vegetarian option available, then I will, go out to the shop. And thinking through those strategies of what you're going to do to enact your intentions has been shown to be really, really effective at helping people to actually manage to do what they intend. Here we've got all of this rich data that can inform those plans. So now it's not so much that, okay, well, what are the possible scenarios that I would end up in? Now we know that it's actually those social scenarios where there are tempting options available. And so it's more about, okay, well, now if that's a situation that's going to get me in trouble, what will I do? So I'm going to a barbecue at a friend's house. What will I do to overcome that temptation that's very clearly going to be there and the research suggests is going to get me into trouble? So that is all I had to say, but this is an ongoing stream of work. We're very much on the more intervention side of it now, so that was the first exercise in terms of mapping, and we're thinking about what to do next, so all thoughts, comments, very, very welcome. Thank you. It was a bit long, sorry.
That's okay, we probably have time for one question if anyone wants to ask one. Yes?
Considering it's a study about sort of intentions and also about regret, including did you consider observer effects? The idea that people being studied and knowing that they were being studied might change their inclination. I could imagine if they knew they were being watched, then they might be more inclined to follow through.
Absolutely. So they had some inclination that they were going to be invited to follow up studies, but it was not super clear for precisely that reason. So we kind of said, based on your responses, we may get in touch and ask you again, and we do it again. I think that would be particularly an issue for the second event reconstruction exercise, having already done one. I think it's definitely an issue, and it will always be an issue for these kinds of DRM studies because, of course, it's quite data intensive. So the act of even filling in these diaries is almost like an intervention itself. I will say over half the population didn't manage to reduce their meat consumption at all. So even if this acted as some sort of intention, it certainly wasn't doing a huge amount of heavy lifting in terms of getting people to act as they intend. One of the things that we found from looking at the baseline and the end line is actually people who reported intentions that were motivated by health or health and environment were much more successful than people who were motivated by environment alone, which I think was an interesting, if somewhat disheartening, finding for somebody who's looking at this from an environmental angle. But yeah, take your point. It hasn't done an awful lot of heavy lifting in terms of making them act as they intend, more so than they might have. But it's an important research design point. Yeah.
Any other questions? I have a quick one, which is,
Yeah.
so if the results suggest, that people aren't very good at following through on these intentions, even for the few that have them, does that imply that this is not something that's going to be solved by individuals alone then?
So mine would be a more hopeful message, that it is about helping people to do that. So that's where I was getting into with the sort of queuing strategies. How do we design environments that makes it easier? So it's actually very hard to opt for vegetarian options often, even on this campus, which you would think is quite progressive. So how can systems be designed around people who have already formulated these intentions to actually make it easier for them to do what they want to do and that would make a difference to the environmental outcomes that we care about? So it's the individual in situ, and there's lots of players in terms of constructing those situations and making whatever options are available, and in changing the social norms around people. So I think the individual has to act in the end, but the environment around them is very much the responsibility of government and corporate actors, and so it's everybody, I would say.
Okay, great.
Cool.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks
No
for
worries.
coming.